Shabbat Shalom. One of my favorite stories tells of a preacher who travels from town to town, an itinerant preacher going from town to town giving his sermons. And so sure enough, he arrives in one small town in the south, and the train gets there early in the morning, and he gets off the train and he's wandering for hours and hours. Sure enough, the afternoon rolls around, and it's about midway through the afternoon, he comes upon a young boy. And he says, "Excuse me, boy, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm new in town, and I've been here for hours and hours wandering around looking for the post office. Can you help me? Could you just tell me where the post office is?" And sure enough, the young boy says, "Sure, you go this way, and you'll get right to the post office, no problem." The preacher says to the young boy, "Thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the directions to the post office. I'll tell you what, in return, I'm going to ask you to come to church tonight, and you'll get a special honor." And the boy says, "That's very nice of you, preacher. Thank you. What are you going to be speaking about at church tonight?" And the preacher says, "Well, I'm going to be talking about how to get to heaven." The young boy looks at the preacher and says, "You don't even know how you're going to get to the post office, and you're going to tell me how to get to heaven?" Children are often a wonderful source of humility for us, aren't they? They keep us very humble. Trust me, the children keep us very humble. And so it is that we turn to our Torah portion this week, Parashat Vayikra, and I'll invite you to open your Eitz Chaim Chumash along with me. I'm on page 585. Page 585 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, we begin the book of Leviticus. And of course, the book of Leviticus is often the time where a rabbi thinks about anything else to speak on other than the actual parsha, because the whole thing's about sacrifices. And so it does get a little complicated to ask, how can we relate this sefer, this book, to our modern lives? And in that vein, there's something interesting in the very first pasuk, the very first verse of our Torah. So here we are on page 585. You see it says, Vayikra el Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. Now, in and of itself, it's a little strange because of the redundancy. Right? If God is calling to Moses, isn't he thus speaking to him? Why do we need to add the extra words? But our rabbis don't entirely focus on that so much. As our rabbis look to expound this very first pasuk, this very first verse of the Torah, they actually look to the very first word, Vayikra. Now, what is strange about the word Vayikra? It's got a small aleph. You see that? If you look at the very first word, yes, there's a humongous aleph to the left. That just indicates that it's the first chapter and the first verse. But at the end of the word Vayikra, there's a tiny aleph. In the actual Torah scroll, there is also a superscript aleph at the very first word of the book of Leviticus. Now, why is that? There are some modern scholars who will say it's very easy. Just as in our own day and age, if someone makes a mistake typing, it's called a typo. So too, in the written transmission of the text over the millennia, every now and again, a mistake will get entered. And if a scribe makes a mistake in a Torah scroll, it's called a scribo. And as a result, sometimes that happens. And so later rabbis came and inserted the aleph just to make sure we knew that it's Vayikra and not Vayikar. Right? Perhaps this is simply a scribo. There's another train of thought that says no. The littlest letter is meant to teach us that this is the very first word that our littlest people should start learning. Because in traditional yeshivot, they don't start learning Torah with Bereshit bara Elokim, with in the beginning God created. Now we know in most liberal circles, we begin teaching our children from the book of Genesis about creation, right? That's the beginning, because that's typically how Western people learn Bible. They start in the beginning. But for yeshiva bachars, for students in the yeshiva, they don't start learning Genesis at age 5. They start learning the book of Leviticus. It's interesting and strange. But they start learning the book of Leviticus by and large because they want to set themselves on a path toward holiness. And the book of Leviticus is all about how can we get closer to God? How do we get closer to God? So perhaps that aleph in there, that little tiny aleph, is a reminder that when we start with our children and want to bring them into their own Judaism, we start by asking the question, how can we bring them closer to God? How can we help elevate them in terms of their holiness? So maybe that little aleph isn't just a scribo. Maybe that little aleph is actually a reminder that when we start with our kids, we start with holiness. There is perhaps another approach. Maybe with that first letter, it's Aleph after all. It is the first letter of the alphabet. Maybe it is written in a small way to say, Vayikra, El Moshe. When we want God to call to us, just as God called to Moses. When we want to deepen our relationship with God and have that special connection the same way Moshe Rabbeinu, the same way Moses did, perhaps we need to make ourselves like that Aleph. We need to shrink ourselves. After all, what is the characteristic most associated with Moshe Rabbeinu, with Moses? Humility. And perhaps if we want to attain the same kind of relationship with God that Moses reached with God, we need to humble ourselves. We need to make ourselves small. Perhaps that Aleph is there as a reminder to be humble. Not to be of low self-esteem, but to engage in self-conscious humility. Of course, we are now, because this is Parashat HaHodesh, this is our cue that we are 2 weeks away from Passover. Now, our rabbis come to teach that just as we spend these next 2 weeks ridding our home of chametz, though I always think it's fascinating, while we're ridding our home of chametz, we're buying and buying all this new stuff. But nevertheless, we spend these next 2 weeks ridding our home of chametz. Our rabbis teach it's not just physical chametz we're supposed to get rid of. It's not just the bread and all of that business. We're supposed to look in our souls and ask what is in us that is rising? What is in us that is making us haughty, that is making us arrogant? And in the last 2 weeks of, the first 2 weeks of Nissan, the last 2 weeks before Passover, just as we seek to clear out our homes of all that leavens, so too should we seek to clear out our souls and our hearts and our minds of all that causes us to rise as well. So as we approach Pesach, as we're 2 weeks away, as we begin this Hebrew month of Nissan, as we begin Sefer Vayikra, let us strive to be like the Aleph. Let us look at our lives and ourselves and ask, how can we remove that which makes us arrogant and haughty, and focus on how we can be more humble, how we can be more like that Aleph. May God bless us in our holy efforts. I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, a Chodesh Tov, and as soon as Passover is, as soon as Shabbat is over, I wish everyone a meaningful and full preparation for Pesach. Shabbat Shalom.